and welcome to Self-Respect. In this chapter, we're going to cover a lot of the topics having to do with self-esteem. Self-esteem is part of the larger issue of self-respect. I'm sure that you're familiar with a lot of the topics we're going to cover in this chapter, but let's hold on and see if I can't surprise you with some new information. All right, let's start by talking about the concept of possible selves. When we study our Rogers as a personality theorist, we discover that he argues that people have possible selves that they hold in their heads. Whoops, I went the wrong direction. Sorry about that. There are two components that make up our sense of self. There's the desired self, the possible self that we dream of becoming, right? That self that is held up as the good way things could go. And then there's the feared self, that part of our possible self that we worry could become true, that we may become that person that we don't want to become. So we have these two different components of our possible selves. And honestly, in reality, we're going to be our future self, our possible self, will probably be made up of some combination of the things that we want to have happen and the stuff that we worry that will happen. Some of those will happen, and so our possible selves are when we cast ourselves out into the future are made up of what we hope will happen and what we worry will happen for ourself, how we will be. Um, Now, these components of our possible selves help to motivate us by identifying specific goals, like I want to be this way, I don't want to be that way, and that helps to energize us towards working towards the desired outcomes or working towards things that would prevent the undesirable outcomes. So, with our two possible selves, what we could really talk about is this idea of an ideal self, the self that contains that desired self, right? The part that we want to be and contains our own goals for ourselves and how we would like to be in the future. And then also that feared self, right? Um, if we don't reach the goals that we have set for our desired self, that's part of our feared self. I'm not going to make it to the outcome that I want. It's going to lead us to maybe feel sad or disappointed, maybe even despondent, or at least that's what we worry will happen. We worry that if we don't reach our desired goals, that then we will be sad or disappointed or despondent over it. That's not necessarily always true, by the way. Not reaching your desired goal does not always guarantee that you're going to end up sad. You may just realize that maybe your desired goal wasn't the appropriate goal. Let's just go through this theory right now. Okay. The ideal self carries with it what is described as promotion focus. So, trying to get ourselves forward, trying to get ourselves where we want to be. The ought self, you might have heard the phrase ought. You ought to do this. You ought to do that. Ought to do this. I ought to do that, right? Other people and us, oftentimes impose an ought self on us. An ought self is that internalization that we carry with us of other people's goals. When we say to ourselves, I ought to want to, or maybe you might say, I should want to, when we say that to ourselves, it's usually a reflection of what other people want for us. Not necessarily what we want, but what we've internalized as the thing we ought to want, which makes it maybe something that we shouldn't let govern us, right? So internalization of other people's goals for us. And when we fail to reach these goals, instead of feeling sad or disappointed or despondent because when it's our own ideal self that we've generated for ourselves, we're going to feel sad about it. It's a loss. But when we fail to achieve the ought self, you'll notice the risk is that we'll feel anxious or that we'll feel guilty about it. Because these are not necessarily our own goals, they are our internalization of other people's goals. And when we don't meet other people's goals, we then feel bad about ourselves. I failed to do it. Not that I feel sad for the loss of what could have been, like what happens with the ideal self, but instead guilt over not meeting other people's expectations. So when we are driven by the ought self, we tend to see a lot of what we call prevention focus. The person is focused on preventing that bad outcome that would make them feel guilty or make them feel anxious. So the focus of a person who's being driven by their ideal self is different from the focus of a person who's being driven by their ought self. So I think you might be able to get from the way I'm phrasing things that ought selves are probably not the healthy motivators for us that the ideal self probably is. So so let's get at the issue of self-esteem. So, one of the things that you can do to measure your own self esteem is to use the Rosenberg Self Esteem Scale, which appears on page 165 of our book. So, here's the Rosenberg Self Esteem Scale as it appears in our book. It's exactly what a lot of researchers use when assessing self esteem because it's a nice, straightforward scale. It's a Likert type setup with responses that run from strongly disagree to strongly agree with no neutral point. You'll notice that there's no middle of the road here. So you're either leaning towards not agreeing or you're leaning towards agreeing with each statement. And you'll notice that the phrasing of the questions, if you haven't taken this already, you might want to pause me so I don't ruin it for you. You'll notice that the phrasing, some of them are positively phrased. I feel that I'm a person of worth, at least on equal basis with others. And some of them are negatively phrased. I wish I could have more respect for myself, right? So some of them are going to encourage you to answer in a way that would reveal that you have high self-esteem, if you have it, or low self-esteem if you have that. Others will flip it so that you would need to say something negative, right? So if you gave, let's say, a 4 to item number 1, you'd probably want to see a number 1 or a 2 for item number 8, right? So it's inverse scored. And it actually has 10 items. It reps to the next page, and then your scoring instructions are found on that next page. So you can go ahead and take the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale and see how those 10 items line up with, maybe your own already existing sense of self-esteem, right? Because I think most of us walk through life already having a pretty decent sense of self-esteem. It turns out that the average person does. And in fact, this one item, I have self-esteem, and a person would respond on this Likert type scale from 1 to 5, is just as accurate as taking the longer 10 item Rosenberg self-esteem scale. So people seem to have a pretty decent sense of what the word self-esteem means and then how much of it they have, right? Like people have a pretty decent sense of that, which is really interesting because in psychology, we're still arguing about a lot of the details having to do with self-esteem. First off, what does this term even mean? Right? It's a construct. It's not an objective thing that we could go out and, objectively watch and see if a person has it or not. It's a construct, and we all basically know what it means, but we don't have a firm objective definition. So instead, we have what we call operational definitions, where we say, well, self esteem is going to be defined as score on the Rosenberg self esteem scale, or self esteem is going to be defined as response to the item, I have high self esteem, right? Like that's how we define it in research. We don't just assume that the reader knows what we mean by self esteem. We have operational definitions for it. So that's one thing that you would notice if you read the literature on self-esteem is that we haven't really fully agreed on what it is. And toward that end, we haven't really agreed whether it's a single entity within a person. These items kind of give the impression that there's a single thing called self-esteem. I have high self-esteem. That sure gives the impression it's a single thing. But a lot of researchers have been arguing that you might have self-esteem as it pertains to your school skill, or self-esteem as it pertains to your interpersonal skills, or your vocational skills, or other things that you might have subdivisions of self-esteem, and that they are in fact independent of each other. You could be feeling great about yourself as an employee and not feeling very good about yourself as an interpersonal functioner as you've just had a breakup or something, or just got into an argument with your best friend or something. So what self-esteem is, how it should be defined, and how monolithic it is still being debated. These things are all being debated in psychology. So I just wanted to make sure that you realize that even though you probably have a pretty good sense of what it means to be talking about self-esteem, it is more complicated than you might be thinking, and that the average person thinks. I think the average person knows what self-esteem is more firmly than a psychologist does. Okay, so what is it? Well, if you go back to the psychodynamic theories, if you recall, that would be they started with Freud, and then we've got like Erickson and Adler and Jung and Horney and other people even actually followed from that. What they all have in common, that makes all those pretty disparate theorists all have in common, is that they believe that our early interactions with our parents set us up for healthy or unhealthy functioning. So even though the psychodynamic theorists never used the word self-esteem, none of them ever used that word or term. The thing that you're probably thinking of as self-esteem, they talked about that. They definitely talked about, how you feel about yourself or self-valuing. A lot of them use that. Um, they thought that that came from how your parents interacted with you when you were growing up. Horney, who was one of Freud's like very close group members, argued that what we're talking about here, she had the term self-awareness. So she didn't use self-esteem, she said self-awareness. And she said, if we get the sense that we are valued and loved by our parents, that will feed into a positive self-awareness or positive self-image. I'm going to try and avoid using the word self-esteem since clearly she didn't use it. But if I fall into old habits and call it self-esteem, try to forgive me. I think it's what she meant. So if our parents made us feel valued and loved, that helped to foster a positive self-image. If, on the other hand, our parents made us feel as if we were being judged, if our parents kept us more at arm's distance and didn't really give us the kind of up close nurturing that maybe we needed, that's going to help foster a negative self image, make us feel maybe even unlovable because even our own parents didn't seem to, passionately love us like parents should, right? Where they're invested in us and really, want the best for us and things like that. So she thought, negative things from our parents would foster a negative self image, and that warmth and value would make us feel positively. If we fall into that negative self image, she said that we can develop a neurotic approach to the world. Um, we are more likely, when we hold a neurotic view of the world, to develop an idealized self. Notice it has that ed on the end of it. It's not what I was talking about at the beginning where I said ideal self, which is something to strive towards. Um, she said idealized self, which is where you have like this fictional sense of self that really isn't even remotely achievable. But you hold this as, unless I can get to this unattainable goal for myself and be this unattainable version of myself, I will not have met my goal. So if I fall short, I failed. And so by having this idealized self, we virtually guarantee that we will always fall short. So the idealized self in her version is the root of all the bad outcomes. And you've developed that idealized self because as a small child, when your parents made you feel judged and they treated you in a distant way, you got the impression that if you had been good enough, if you had been idealized enough, your parents wouldn't have treated you like that. So it starts in childhood and then continues on into adulthood. All right, so we had Karen Horney. How about Alfred Adler? Um, I don't know why I have Jung here too, so just please forgive. Adler is over here on the right. Um, but he said that when we were little, physically little, small, that we naturally felt small and weak. Kind of makes sense. We were small, we were weak. Um, but if we were made to feel even smaller and weaker than we should have, where maybe our parents bullied us, or maybe we had older siblings who made us feel small and weak and victimized, or maybe we were given messages of, well, when you're bigger, you'll be able to do this. And what the speaker meant is older, but what they said was bigger. A lot of adults say that to kids. Well, when you're bigger, you'll be able to do that. And what they mean is, when you're a teenager, you'll be able to do it or whatever. And so a child might internalize that when I am bigger, I will be able to do it. That means you are currently small and you are currently incapable. That kind of messaging, according to Adler, can feed an inferiority complex in adulthood. You might have heard that term inferiority complex before. Adler's the one who generated that term. That feeling that I am not enough. I'm not strong enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not like everybody else is outperforming me. That's inferiority. And then complex is a term that he coined to refer to like a bunch of psychological things that are going on inside of our heads as a result of, in this case, a sense of inferiority. So having this pressure that makes us feel small and weak when we're children can carry over into adulthood where we continue to feel small and weak, even as we are not, even as we've gotten bigger and we are more powerful and certainly have some agency in our lives and things like that. We still carry around that little child's attitude that I'm small and no one will take me seriously and those kinds of things. So that's where, for Adler, he didn't call it self-esteem either, but that's where this sort of negative self-esteem can come from, is by being made to feel small when you're a child. Erik Erikson, who I called Carl Jung a second ago, that's Erik Erikson there on the left. Um, he said, we have these major social conflicts that we address throughout childhood. And how we settle those conflicts, if they tend to settle on the positive side, that will tend to feed more positive sense of what we would call self-esteem. He called it something more like um, confidence that you can accomplish the next task. Sort of, he didn't use the word self-esteem. But when we solve a conflict on the positive side, it builds what today we would call self-esteem, positive self-esteem. If, on the other hand, we resolve one of those conflicts on the negative side, then we are more likely to build a negative sense of self-esteem. So let's talk briefly about what is present in Erikson stages. And I'm not going to go through these in detail. This is something we tend to cover in lifespan development. But at different points along our development throughout life, Erikson says there are conflicts that we face. So like in infancy, there's a conflict between whether the environment is trustworthy or we need to develop mistrust for the environment. The positive solution to that conflict would be the trust side, and it helps to foster attachment and bonding. And so this kind of relates to what Horney said, right? The idea that having parents who are loving and, to value us, that tends to build self-esteem. Erikson's saying a lot of the same thing right here, that during infancy, if we feel like we can trust our environment, we can attach to our environment. We can become bonded with our environment. Early childhood, the conflict is between autonomy versus shame and doubt. And in this conflict, you're worried about doing it yourself, being competent as an individual yourself, versus being made to feel bad about your efforts to try and do things yourself. He really focused on early childhood because he said there are these big things going on: potty training, feeding yourself, learning to dress yourself, these kinds of things that happen in early childhood, that if you show autonomy and try and do it your way and do it yourself, and you're successful in that, the environment encourages you for that, that'll build self-esteem. But on the other hand, if the environment makes you feel bad, then you may end up with a negative outcome, and that would lower self-esteem. I just want to point out, giving feedback about their autonomous behaviors. You've got your shirt on backwards. Let's look. It has a logo on the front. Let's turn it around so the logo's in the front. That is not shaming a child. Giving them guidance about how to do it is not shaming them. It's giving them the tools that they need to accomplish the task. So I just wanted to throw that in there because there are some modern parenting techniques that argue that you shouldn't correct your child if they've got their shoes on the wrong feet, or if they've got their clothes on backwards, or things like that. How else are they ever supposed to figure it out if they're not given feedback? So feedback, but it doesn't have to be mean. Don't you even know? I mean, why are you even trying to do this yourself? That would be shame and doubt. But look, there's a logo on your shirt. Let's turn it, that belongs in the front. Let's turn your shirt around so you can see the logo, right? Like, that is not shaming a child. Early school years, we have the conflict between initiative versus guilt. So, this is where the child is trying to be a self starter versus they might be made to feel guilty for their efforts to try and be a self starter. So, this is the period of time where academic success, making friends are really big pressures on children. And when they're made to feel guilty about their efforts to try and do stuff on their own, so a little autonomy there. And then also to start something new. For example, if you have an early school years child who says that they want to join the baseball team, and the parents say, well, if you do it, you need to stick with it. You're such a quitter. You never finished that soccer season that we signed you up for, or whatever. That's guilt. That's making them feel like their efforts at showing initiative are probably going to result in failure. And you don't really want to do that to a child. So, fostering their initiative. School age children, now we're talking about kids who are probably 8 to about 12 years old. Their big conflict is industry versus inferiority. So they are learning to make friends. They're learning to their times tables. They're learning things that at this period in their life, they're really willing to do the industry, to really practice and to work on something. If they, even in their own heads, are initiating industry and then comparing themselves, which is really common during this age bracket, to their peers, and they personally feel like they're not measuring up, that can be the beginning of some negative self esteem. If their adults in their lives are comparing their outputs or their efforts to someone else's and they're not measuring up. Oh, your brother always was able to do this. Oh, your friends can do it. These kinds of pieces of feedback can foster inferiority in a sense that I'm not as good as the other people. So, school age children have that conflict. Adolescents, you might remember the big conflict between identity versus role confusion, where you were trying to figure out who am I, what do I like, what kind of music do I like, how do I want to dress. All of those things that we were testing out in adolescence are normal parts of trying to figure out our own sense of identity. One of the big positives that comes from figuring out who we are is that it enables us to become loyal to other people. And so, one of the big things that's going on in adolescence is very deeply loyal friendships in adolescence that then can become romantic relationships and other things, which is good because this is great practice for young adulthood, where the big challenge is between forming intimate relationships versus finding yourself isolated from other people. If you solve this on the positive side, you become capable of falling in love and you feel competent to fall in love. It's a self esteem issue, isn't it? That you feel like you would be desirable, that you feel like other people would want you, and that other people are deserving of your attention. Um, During the mature years, I labeled it here, it's, like 40 to about 65. The big conflict is between generativity versus stagnation. Really, generativity means to leave a mark on the future, versus stagnation. Why am I even here? What is the point? I don't feel like I'm growing and developing anymore. Solving it on the positive side makes it more likely that a person can raise and nurture their own children. If they don't have their own children, they can help nurture other people's children. If they don't have other people's children that they can help with, they can mentor colleagues at work. They can do after school programs. There are other things where they could literally have an impact on other people, or they can leave their mark by writing a book or creating art or other things that could be left behind where other people would know you produced something and you left it behind for the other humans to know about. That's what generativity is really at the heart all about. And you can see where self esteem is necessary for that, right? You need to feel good about yourself to be able to say, I have something worthy to leave behind. The last stage in Erickson's development is the old age period, so over age 65, and the conflict is between integrity versus despair. If you solve this on the positive side with integrity, it's more likely that you'll develop wisdom, which is a whole chapter in this book. So, being able to develop wisdom is a big, important aspect of full maturity. On the other side, if you resolve this on the negative side, you're more likely to fall into despair, where you wish you could do it over, like honestly wish that you're afraid of ultimate death because you're like, I messed up too much and I didn't do it right. I want to do over, that kind of thing. Whereas a person who solved it on the side of integrity is more likely to have the self-esteem to be able to look back and say, yes, I had some rough patches. Maybe I made some bad decisions. Maybe there were some things that didn't go the way that my ideal self would have liked me to have done it. But ultimately, I lived a good life. I did the best that I could. I learned lessons from the things that I experienced, and I grew and I developed. And that's the important thing about life. So I'm sorry, I went through kind of fast the Erickson stages. I did want to address each of them, but if you're really into this topic, you might want to read up on Erickson stages because they are very interesting. But you could see how self-esteem could grow or be depleted at any of these stages. It's not just about what happens to you in childhood, like Freud or Horney or Adler might have said. All right, I'm going to stop here and I'll come back in the next segment. We'll switch over into humanism.